Imagine waking up this morning, making your tea, checking the news, and discovering that 4 million British citizens have just been told, sorry, you don't get to vote this year after all. Not because of a natural disaster, not because of a pandemic, not because of some genuine emergency, but because the government has decided that local elections are a bit inconvenient right now, what with all the restructuring and reorganising they're supposedly doing. 27 councils are asking to postpone their May elections, 21 of them run by Labour, which just happens to be the party currently plummeting in the polls and facing the very real prospect of getting absolutely hammered at the ballot box. But I'm sure that's just a coincidence. I'm sure there's absolutely no connection between Labour's historically bad polling numbers and their sudden enthusiasm for postponing democracy. None whatsoever. Welcome to Britain in 2026, where voting is apparently optional if it's politically inconvenient. Quick favour, if this story makes your blood boil even half as much as it should, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Over 94% of you haven't subscribed yet. It's free, takes 2 seconds, and helps us keep shining a light on this absolute nonsense. Cheers if you did. Right, let's tear this apart. So, here's the situation in all its grotesque detail. Out of 63 local authorities that were given the option to postpone their May elections, 27 are expected to ask for delays before today's deadline. Of those 27, 21 are run by Labour. Let me say that again so it really sinks in. 21 Labour-run councils are asking to postpone elections, whilst their party is currently about as popular as a wasp at a picnic. 21 councils have already requested delays, 34 have said they'll proceed as planned, and 8 were still deciding as of last night. Once the deadline passes, Local Government Secretary Steve Reed is expected to approve these requests, meaning nearly 600 councillors, including just under 200 Labour councillors, will get to keep their jobs for at least another year without facing the inconvenience of, actually asking voters if they still want them. Now, the government's official justification for all this is that they're in the middle of a massive overhaul of local government, and holding elections whilst restructuring would be complicated and confusing. Fair enough, you might think. Reorganising local government is indeed a complex undertaking, and perhaps it makes sense to delay elections until the new structures are in place. Except here's the problem. Last month, ministers told these councils they'd approve delays if there were genuine concerns about delivering elections alongside the restructuring. Genuine concerns, that's the phrase. But who decides what counts as a genuine concern? Why, the government does, of course. The same government that's currently polling somewhere between disastrous and apocalyptic, and would very much prefer not to face voters right now, thank you very much. Under a clause in the 2000 Local Government Act, Steve Reed has the power to change the year in which elections will be held. That's legal. That's within the rules. Nobody's technically breaking any laws here. But just because something is legal doesn't mean it's right. And just because you have the power to do something, you shouldn't use it. Democracy isn't just about following the letter of the law, it's about respecting the spirit of it. And the spirit of democracy is that people get to regularly hold their representatives accountable through the ballot box. When you start cancelling elections because they're inconvenient, you're not respecting that spirit. You're trampling all over it whilst claiming you're doing everyone a favour. And the opposition parties are absolutely not having it, although their responses are rather revealing in different ways. The Conservatives, through Shadow Local Government Secretary Sir James Cleverly, have accused Labour of denying democracy and running scared of voters' verdict on their appalling leadership. He pointed out that Labour promised elections would go ahead and have now U-turned yet again. Cleverly stated it cannot be right that some elected representatives will now be serving 7-year terms and that residents have a right to choose who represents them. All fair points, all legitimate criticisms, all absolutely correct, except there's one tiny problem with the Conservatives getting on their high horse about this, and his name is Nigel Farage.
Because whilst the Conservatives are busy clutching their pearls about Labour cancelling elections, Nigel Farage has pointed out something rather inconvenient. He said, and I quote, "How dare the Tory fraudsters complain about cancelled elections? 7 Conservative councils colluded with Labour last year. 3 will repeat it for a second year in a row. Never trust what they say." That's absolutely devastating because it's true. The Conservatives are complaining about something they themselves participated in just last year. It's like watching someone lecture you on healthy eating whilst they're halfway through their 3rd Big Mac of the day. The hypocrisy is genuinely staggering. Farage went further, warning of collusion between Labour and the Conservatives, and Reform UK is apparently planning to challenge the government in the courts over these delays. Now, whether that legal challenge has any chance of success is another matter entirely, but the political point is a sharp one. Both major parties have participated in cancelling elections when it suited them, and now they're pointing fingers at each other, hoping nobody notices they're both guilty of the same thing. It's political theatre at its absolute worst, where everyone's more concerned about scoring points against their opponents than actually defending democratic principles.
But then we've got the Liberal Democrats weighing in, and their position is rather interesting. Leader Sir Ed Davey said, "We must never allow this to happen again," and called for the law to be changed so ministers cannot simply delay elections at the stroke of a pen. That's actually a substantive policy proposal. That's saying, regardless of who's in government, this power should not exist or should be severely restricted. And you know what? He's absolutely right. The fact that a government minister can unilaterally decide to postpone elections should worry everyone, regardless of their political affiliation. Today, it might be Labour using this power when they're unpopular. Tomorrow, it could be the Conservatives. The day after, it could be whoever else manages to win power. The principle matters more than the party. Even the Electoral Commission, the independent body responsible for overseeing elections in the UK, has raised concerns about these delays. They've outlined that the power to postpone elections should only be used in exceptional circumstances, like the COVID pandemic, and they've questioned whether a local government reorganisation meets that threshold. Think about that for a moment. The official electoral watchdog, the people whose literal job is to ensure fair and proper elections, are saying, "Hang on, this doesn't seem right." That's not partisan opposition, that's professional concern from the experts who understand how democracy is supposed to function. And here's what makes this entire situation even more galling. This is the 2nd year in a row that local elections have been delayed. The government did this last year, they're doing it again this year, and there's absolutely nothing stopping them from doing it again next year, if it's still politically convenient. We're establishing a precedent here, a dangerous one, where elections can be postponed whenever the government decides it's a bit awkward to hold them. That's not how democracies are supposed to work. Elections are meant to be fixed, predictable, unavoidable. They're meant to be the mechanism through which politicians are held accountable whether they like it or not. Let's talk about what this means for the actual people affected, because 4 million Britons aren't just statistics, they're real people with real concerns about their local areas who are being denied the opportunity to have their say. Some of these councillors will now be serving 7-year terms. 7 years! That's longer than most parliamentary terms. That's longer than many people stay in the same job or the same house. That's an entire generation of primary school children going from reception to year 6 without their local councillors facing re-election. How can anyone pretend that's democratic? How can anyone claim with a straight face that this is just about administrative convenience? And let's consider the timing, because it's rather suspicious, isn't it? Labour are currently experiencing what can only be described as a polling catastrophe. They won a massive majority in the last general election, partly because the Conservative vote collapsed, and partly because of widespread desire for change after years of Tory government. But since taking power, they've struggled to maintain popular support.
Various policy decisions, economic challenges, and internal party tensions have led to approval ratings that would make even Liz Truss blush. And now, facing local elections where they were expected to lose significant numbers of council seats, suddenly there's an urgent need to postpone democracy. The optics are absolutely terrible. Now, the government would argue, and probably will argue, that they're caught in an impossible situation. If they proceed with elections whilst restructuring local government, voters might be confused about what they're voting for, what areas their councillors will represent, and how the new structures will work. That confusion could lead to lower turnout, spoiled ballots, and general chaos. Better, they'd say, to postpone until everything is sorted and voters can make informed decisions. That argument has some merit, genuinely it does. But here's the counter-argument. If the restructuring is creating such chaos that elections cannot be held, perhaps the problem is the restructuring, not the elections. Perhaps the government should have planned this better, should have timed things differently, should have ensured that democratic processes could continue uninterrupted whilst administrative changes happened in the background. There's also a broader question about what message this sends to the British public about their democracy. We live in an age where trust in institutions is at historic lows, where conspiracy theories flourish, where people genuinely question whether their vote matters or whether the whole system is rigged. And then the government goes and does something like this, cancelling elections that were supposed to happen, keeping politicians in power without asking voters if that's what they want, and doing it in a way that just happens to benefit the party currently in government. How do you think that looks to the average person? How do you think that affects their trust in the democratic system? How do you think that impacts their willingness to engage with politics when they're repeatedly told their voice matters and then denied the opportunity to actually use it? The Conservatives, for all their current complaints, have said they opposed delaying elections last year and have pledged to vote against the postponements again. James cleverly insists democracy must prevail and voters must be able to make their voices heard. Noble sentiments, genuinely. But as Farage pointed out, 7 Conservative councils participated in cancellations last year and 3 are doing it again this year. So what we have is Conservative MPs in Westminster voting against delays whilst Conservative councillors in town halls are requesting them. That's not principled opposition, that's having your cake and eating it too, claiming credit for defending democracy whilst benefiting from its suspension when it suits you. Reform UK's plan to challenge this in court is interesting because it raises the question of what grounds they'd use. Is postponing elections under the 2000 Local Government Act actually illegal, or is it just politically questionable? The courts generally don't like getting involved in political disputes unless there's a clear legal violation. But perhaps Reform's lawyers have found an angle. Perhaps they'll argue that the power is being abused, that the circumstances don't meet the threshold for postponement, that voters' rights are being violated. Even if the case fails, and it very well might, it keeps the issue in the headlines and reinforces the narrative that the establishment parties are colluding to avoid accountability.